Yes, we have started now with the recording. So welcome everybody. We are going to start now with our third lecture of the Everything Need to Change public lectures series organized by the Architect Climate Network Finland. As we already mentioned before, this is part of the 10 public lecture about the urgent societal transformation that is needed across our sector of society, including the built environment. And today we have three great speakers, and we will discuss about how to make the green transformation just. Yes, we know that everything needs to change, but what is the price of this change? Are we leaving anyone behind? So we will start today with our first speaker, that Sophie, please, you can introduce her.
Yes, so we're honored to welcome Faith Yeno, and she's actually dialing in from, 550 kilometers north of Nairobi in Kenya. And she's a practicing architect and lecturer at the Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology in Kenya. She has a PhD in architecture and an MSc in sustainable architecture studies, both from the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. She's also fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the UK, and she's been involved in teaching at the University of Sheffield and the University of Manchester. Her research interest is in understanding the implications of contextual dynamics, socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental, on the articulation of architectural design concepts, particularly with regards to the development of sustainable built environments. She's passionate about understanding the needs of a society and working with them to develop appropriate spatial solutions. So over to you, Faith, the floor is yours. And as you know, we're recording this as well, and we have then some time immediately after for questions from the other speakers or from any of the people attending as well.
Hey, can you see my screen? Yes. Oh, all right. Thank you very much for having me give this talk. As I was telling Sophie, I'm on fieldwork. That's very interesting, the setup I've had to do this talk, but I'm really happy to do it. Then again, this talk might be a bit broad or abstract for what we're talking about, but I think it might just be right. So to begin with, I think allow me to ask one of the most basic questions, or one very basic two questions. Oh, I think my screen, okay. So I think A4, I think that's one of the most basic questions that we've asked. So I was hoping everyone in their mind said A4, APO. So my question is then, given that learning, especially at the formative years, is relational, how is A for apple for a child like this in my country who has never seen an apple, for example? So just keep that in mind as we think about this talk. The second thing is, what is a green roof? When you think about a green roof, what comes to mind? So my question is this a green roof or is that a green roof? So my talk is centered around Nairobi, Kenya, which is my country, but then broadly Africa. So a little about Nairobi. It's the capital city of Kenya, and it's located in East Africa. So the equator cuts the country right in the middle, and therefore I think arguably we have the best climate in the world. And for fun fact, it's the only city in the world that has a national park right in between the city. So this was development in Nairobi between the 1950s and the 1980s, and this was in the period known as the modern movement or tropical architecture. So a lot of this was borrowed from Le Corbusier's work, and this formed the basis of the most African city skyline. But this is the kind of development we're having now in Nairobi and in many other cities in Africa. So currently, majority of the countries in the global south bear an insignificant contribution to the global climate change when compared to Western countries. However, the UN estimates that the built environment or the building stock will grow by 75% compared to 25% of that in the Western world by 2050. And therefore, it's clear that the global south will have the highest potential in influencing the future climate change. So what does this then mean? So broadly, African countries such as Kenya currently struggle with two seemingly divergent forces. On the one hand, the desire to develop as modeled by the West, and on the other hand, the critical demand for environmental justice, consciousness, and responsibility. So that's what influenced my research. What is sustainable design? A lot of words or a lot of terms or a lot of concepts have come up as a result of what is sustainable design. But my research is asking what really is sustainable design? What, who, why are they being sustained? What groups do they represent and what power of agency do these groups hold? And what is the underlying biases or interests these groups have? And it is an attempt to assess and critique the discourse and practice of sustainable design within the context of the global south. So in asking what does it mean, who decides, and sustainable for what, there seems to be a clear antagonistic relationship between the standardization of this concept of sustainable design and the contextual diversity that exists among different contexts or within different contexts, especially in Nairobi. So my research broadly argues that the Western epistemology of looking at sustainable design creates a form of dominance and supremacy, while the local constructions of knowledge struggle to deal with local challenges and priorities on one hand, while seeking legitimacy from the West on the other hand. So it creates what I call the Western intention versus the Southern response. So this pursuit of legitimacy from the West stems from what the Western represents for developing countries like Kenya. Overall, two fundamental issues are part correlated and part emergent, and that's the Western intention and the Southern response. So by way of example, maybe if we look at rating tools or assessment systems, which is one of the most popular ways of gauging how sustainable building is. You look at it in the case, predominantly they are developed by the West. So besides the obvious economic or capitalistic gain from establishing a global footprint, like any other standard, the Western intention is to establish authority and control to define, dictate, and determine what counts as green and sustainable. And unfortunately, cities like Nairobi, on the other hand, play into this intention by adopting these systems without interrogating them. And I could give an example, very many examples in my country, Kenya. We have buildings that are now really struggling to get things like LEED certified gold. But you find in my country, for example, our standard walls are 200 millimeters thick. But for you to get LEED gold, then we have people building walls of 500 millimeters thick with insulation inside, just to check that box for LEED certification. So this becomes very expensive for any investor. And of course, then it doesn't really respect the environment that we are living in. So a lot of these systems are being adopted without necessarily interrogating the climate of Kenya properly, or even the socioeconomic status of people in Nairobi. So, then this talk, I'd like to engage in the larger discourse of the politics of knowledge and its construction in relation to sustainability. And I'm trying to confront the Western construction of the concept of sustainability, and by extension, sustainable design, as it is imposed in developing cities, specifically in Nairobi. I seek to challenge the hegemony embedded in Western Eurocentric knowledge forms of construction. And again, in this case, with regards to sustainable design. So the argument is constructed through an analysis of Western imperialism against the global South, first as a consequence of its colonial past, then closely but followed by modernity, the concept of modernity, and then lastly, globalization and how those have informed the concept of sustainable design or the concept of even architecture as a whole within these countries. So when you look at colonization has had far-reaching effects, not only in Nairobi's built environment, but also in the language, in the culture, in identity. So beyond territorial control, colonization meant the destruction of and the legitimization or not only of indigenous culture, but also established cultural and scientific knowledge, ontologies, and epistemologies. It involves the imposition of a world system that what Grofgel asserts, a European capitalist, military, Christian, patriarchal, white, heterosexual male arrived in Africa and established simultaneously in time and in space several entangled global hierarchies, thereby creating what Escobar terms as privileged epistemologies and a political space. And just to give even an example outside this talk, as I mentioned, I'm on field work and I happened to see a bird on my way here, and I asked one of the people, the bird is called a welcome bird among this community, but the actual name it's called the goodbye birds in the English. So the English translation was that bird is a goodbye bird, but that bird is only found in East Africa. And the people of this community told me that that's a welcome bird. So when you hear that sound, it alerts you that there are guests coming and they are welcoming the guests. But unfortunately, in the English language, it is called a goodbye bird, which is the opposite of what that bird is, yet it doesn't exist outside East Africa. Anyway, so the Western world actively created distorted narratives and misrepresented African realities as knowledge from indigenous societies was collected to advance the colonial agenda. And as I said, the second thing is modernity, which is what we had earlier talked about, because the Western construction of modernity was and still is an extension of the Western hegemonic legacy that came to fruition after coloniality. So the Western modality was part of the larger colonial legacy, whose epistemology was not only to deculturize the global South, but more significantly, to portray and replicate Western culture as superior in an attempt to produce a homogeneous Western culture. And that ensured that they continued their hegemony. So the modern values were systematically entrenched in language, governance, religious and education systems established by the West and in their colonies in the global South. And this is still felt largely in our country. Even if you look at the curriculum, a lot of the curriculum is still based on the British interpretation of what African is, who discovered what. All this is really still entrenched in this idea of trying to develop. And so the idea of splitting the country or splitting the world into the modern and the ones yet to become modern then caused this dichotomy that still that forces the global South to continue to try to emulate what the West is doing. And of course, with regards to sustainable design, it is at the expense of the environment, as we can already begin to see. So therefore, the legitimacy of African culture and knowledge forms is measured and determined only against the terms of Western knowledge forms. Africa began to define themselves in the eyes of the West. And as Chinua Achebe submits, until the lion learns to write, the narrative will always glorify the hunter. So lastly, as a way of background, is Escobar submits that globalization entails the universalization and radicalization of modernity. The theory of globalization is confined to Western construction, driven fundamentally by capitalistic processes and exploitation, often of the global South. And accumulation mainly by the global North. So capitalism therefore became a model of power and control, particularly for the exploitation of labor and resources from the global South for the production of commodities for the global for a global market. And we're still seeing this to date. Even when we talk about sustainable design, we're still seeing how African countries are being exploited in order to further the development of other countries. And this can be easily seen, for example, when we talk about carbon trading, where because of the inability for the African countries like Kenya to develop as fast, then we begin to trade our carbons, and therefore it continues to thwart our development, one, but then it continues to allow the Western world to develop the same way they have been developing. And because African countries were already at a deficit in terms of, let's say, global emissions. So it doesn't change the global environment at all, because if we were not, contributing as much to the global, so we're giving what we were not using, and therefore the overall change is very insignificant, if at all, and it's still at the expense of the global South or countries in the global South. So the globalization of Western knowledge and Western culture constantly reaffirms the West view of itself as the center of legitimate knowledge, the arbiter of what counts as knowledge, and the source of civilized knowledge. Again, if we look at the idea of rating assessment systems, which I think is a really good example, because unfortunately, especially in my country, sustainable buildings or sustainability has been made almost synonymous to certified building. So that is how sustainable design has been defined. It's almost sustainability is a certified building. And unfortunately, the certified buildings are actually very bad examples of sustainable buildings. So with regards to globalization or capitalism for that matter, with reference to sustainable design in Nairobi, the introduction of assessment systems, more often than not, these systems are introduced to developing countries with the intention to increase their global footprint and further the country's origin on agenda, overlooking local priorities and dynamic. These systems come to enable technologies and products with enabling technologies and products, among other things. So for example, in order to achieve LEED certification, prescribed technologies and products have to be employed. Therefore, manufacturers of green materials, for example, will benefit from these global footprints through the validation and endorsement of these products by international governing institutions driving the agenda. So none of these materials are produced in my country. So therefore, we need to not only, we're not only importing knowledge, we are importing materials, we are importing labor, and we are importing the actual products that go into making these buildings green. And then unfortunately, after all that, they do not really sit well with the environment, or they are not actually as sustainable as the term would suggest, or as the badge that they hold suggests. So the absurdity of the concept of universalization, or the idea that these assessment systems bring, is that the process of knowledge construction is bound by contexts in which it is being produced. Then global knowledge is in fact local knowledge. It's local to the West. Thus, the West relies on the failure of countries like Nairobi or cities like Nairobi to distinguish its locality, thereby feeding the hegemony. So as we said, colonization brought about cultural delegitimization, whereas modernity was epistemological supremacy, and there was globalization that has brought about economic dependence, right? So after all that, what then should we do? How then should we think of sustainability? So I argue that then sustainability should be thought of in different terms, especially different from those that we started it. And I think the beginning should be to look at the concept of situatedness advanced by Haraway. It introduces a conceptual space that is aware and critical of epistemological, ontological, political, and even ethical positions from which existing sustainable design knowledge claims can be interrogated. Situated knowledge challenges the universalist construction of knowledge. In other words, it challenges what counts as knowledge, arguing fundamentally that knowing is context specific. So it goes beyond simply taking an anti-colonial or anti-West stance to deliberate attempts towards self-determination by developing local epistemologies, methodologies, and approaches that consider local political, social, cultural, and material circumstances in the global South, and which influence and transform knowledge construction on sustainable design. Furthermore, it asserts the importance of understanding the manner in which local communities understand and theorize their own realities. The principle of self-determination gives local people the power to define priorities, determine issues that need to be highlighted, and gives them the opportunity to discuss these issues amongst themselves, as well as measure their progress. And I think when we began, I said I'm doing some field work, and I'm looking at a wind farm that is in Turkana, that is north of Nairobi, and it is hailed as, the biggest wind farm in Africa. However, the people who actually live in Turkana do not like that project at all. For starters, it is generating power or electricity, but none of it is actually being sold to the locals. So the area where the wind farm is still is not really connected by electricity for those. I mean, the injustices that went about in the pursuit of land, in the displacement of people, in not asking what priorities those people had is really huge. But the narrative, of course, is said, private developers came and invested in Nairobi or in Kenya rather. And of course, then they get, there's a lot of accreditation they get from doing that, but at the expense of the local communities that are here. So those solutions are not determined by the local communities. They are not good for the context, right? And they're not situated to the concept. So my argument is not opposed to Western knowledge and theory in its entirety. It is sensitive to the pertinence and the manner in which this knowledge and these theories are introduced and imposed and applied within the local context. Beyond this, I'm skeptical about the Western world's capacity, intentions, and methodologies to advance sustainable design solutions that would benefit local communities in Nairobi and in other cities in the global South. So it is not enough just to acknowledge multiplicity or plurality, as colonial power structures were also predicated by acknowledging these differences and using them to subjugate others. It is critical, therefore, to interrogate the ontological and epistemological lenses through which this multiplicity is acknowledged. So I propose that we should then be asking the same questions that we started with when we are looking at sustainable design in the global South or other marginalized areas. So we should be asking who defines what the research problem is that sustainable solution is being looked for. Why is a study worth doing and why is it relevant? Who is it for? Who would benefit from it? What kind of impact is it going to have on the society? Is it positive or is it negative? And the process of research, does it allow the society to determine their priorities, to determine what counts for them as sustainable, to determine, does it acknowledge their diversity? Does it bring about social justice within the society? So by way of conclusion, I'm going to ask the question A4 again as we think about it. So in summation, my core argument is that contrary to the abstract, universalist and reductionist Western Eurocentric epistemologies, which did not recognize the epistemologies, the colonial methodologies should be adopted in order to reconceptualize, reconstruct, and rearticulate diverse contextual alternative realities. This can be summed in what Escobar's notion of other worlds and worlds otherwise. That is, worlds that are more just and sustainable, and at the same time, worlds that are defined through the principles other than those that are Eurocentric. So this speaks to the intention of this discourse to not only continue the dialogue of developing sustainable built environments, which in this case would be world otherwise, but to develop contextual other worlds, versions of sustainable world. So in essence, what I'm saying is, I started by saying A can be for Africa or any other thing like, avocado, if that's what you relate to. So this is what then McNally calls the diversality as a universal project. So thank you for having me.
Wow, I have many thoughts and questions. Short, brief, but a powerful punch, particularly starting with your apple as well, because it's a very simple way of kind of showing that how what something comes in our mind, other people wouldn't even know what that is, and how do you even start without recognizing that. But let's see if we've got any questions. If people want to in the chat ask any questions, or also unmute the mic, that's fine too, or virtually raise the hand before you do this. We don't get everybody at the same time. I also want to check in with Jonathan and Inari if you have any immediate questions before, otherwise Raul and I ask some. So just checking in with the other speakers first.
I do not know.
No. Inari, what about you?
Yeah, well, I could ask a question from Faith. What is there any positive physical, like any positive physical examples, or kind of like good examples of where somebody would have solved the sustainability issue there in the local context in a good way?
If you unmute Faith, you're still on mute as well.
Sorry, so yes, there are several examples, but unfortunately they are not looked at as sustainable establishment. And I always say, for example, if you look at my grandmother's hut, even in the village, she's oriented the buildings right. She's gotten enough thermal mass for her house. She's collecting rainwater. She's using local available materials. She's using local labor. So a lot of buildings then are sustainable if you look at local context. And I would even argue that that's why the term sustainability did not really begin in the global south, because the term sustainable design came to solve a problem, but that problem was not really existent, especially looking at our local building. In fact, it would be interesting if I could have even showed you this very simple resort that I am staying in right now. It's really sustainable, but none of it is actually hailed as sustainability. So even during my research, looking around the buildings that are called sustainable, because they have been defined by the Western concept, because they have been designed by the idea of certification, then those are not sustainable. But certainly there are people who are doing buildings that can be termed sustainable, just not the manner in which maybe the West will define what sustainable is. So yes, there are buildings that I would say, are sustainable.
I can see that Steve has got a question, but perhaps I wonder, Faith, before we give the floor to Steve, is it perhaps to do with this whole low tech versus high tech, whereby, the sort of low tech doesn't get valued and is seen as like low vernacular technology. And as you say, these buildings are not the ones contributing to the resource problem or to the climate crisis. But then the high tech is seen as a solution when actually it's part of the problem. And is it that sort of perception as well of that high tech is then seen as Western and therefore good, and low tech is local vernacular and then considered as less sustainable, less good in that sense? Or is there not such a tension, or is it because of that tension?
Yes, there exists that tension between low tech and high tech, and therefore, and as I said, trying to develop as modeled by the West. But even when we just look at the high-tech buildings, I think the bigger problem is trying to look at what priorities are there. So for example, if you look at Kenya, where 70% of our energy is actually green energy. Therefore, if you look at any rating systems, the most amount of credits you'll get is for making your building energy efficient. But the least is to get it water efficient. Yet Kenya is considered a water scarce city or country. So you get very little points for making your building more water efficient, and you get so much for making your building more energy efficient. Yet it's a lot easier to make it energy efficient overall than it is to get it water efficient. So it is, yes, the idea of looking at the building in terms of, yes, low tech versus high tech, but also when you just look at any development that is coming up, it is because of Western influence, then you find the development becomes very, very expensive. So if you look at even the first buildings that I showed, we're having glass towers in a tropical climate. So we are basically having offices inside greenhouses, and therefore the energy it takes just to cool those buildings is too much. So then you get somebody who has done a glass building in the city, having, you know, cooling that building and then getting credits for solving a problem they created because of this idea of, you know, modeling towards the West. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that further. Steve, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant. I'm afraid I joined a little late. Brilliant to hear everything that you've said, Faith. But I think it would be helpful, I think, broadly speaking, to somehow move away from the idea of Western. I agree it came from capitalism, which started geographically in a certain part of the world. But that's the conception that underpins it. I beg your pardon. The misconception that kicked it off was that somehow humankind knows better than the rest of the other species about how to do what needs to be done, and therefore they set about enriching themselves at the expense of other species. And at a time, of course, when the people that you correctly, or rather, I know who you're talking about when you're talking about the Western culture. They thought that black people were not of the same species as them, and therefore they were the white people were entitled to mistreat the black people because, well, they're obviously of a lower. Now, I beg your pardon. To get back onto a more unifying note, the point that I would try to make. All indigenous populations before capitalism arrived, including the population in this country here, sorry, I'm in London. I'm in England. Were all sustainable. There were everything was agrarian. Everybody knew that whatever we took off the land needed to be shared, but not only amongst ourselves, but off those other animals that we lived with. That needed to care for in order to, you know, the animals that we tended and the land that we tilled, we couldn't do it without them. And this, just if I can wrap this one up, this is the cornerstone of what Marx and Engels, their critique of capitalism was all about: humankind's relationship with not only with the rest of nature but other species. And I'm sorry to be busting in and going on about so long. So thank you, Chair. Thank you, and keep at it, Faith. Keep at it.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if you want to add to that. That was more of a comment. I think that the point about indigenous is pretty correct, although I think there's also some societies that have also gone beyond their footprint and didn't necessarily tread very lightly on the earth, but it depends on how far back you go as well. And that includes the Romans, for example, and Roman cities, and I think also New Zealand, also some societies. But let's see if there's any other questions we want to pick up on, because one that I'd be interested to hear from you, Faith, what is the discussion in Kenya about now COP26 coming up and the huge controversial issue about the fact that if we stick with the wording Western countries and you know, that they haven't been paying into the budget to enable other countries to actually prepare and adapt to climate change and for that green transition. What are the discussions, or is it what are you hearing in Kenya as part of that debate? Because as again, the West is very much calling the shots, and other people just have to agree to it, it seems.
Yeah, I think that's, I don't know whether to call it the frustration. I think it's about voice and the power of voice. So the talk, especially within the Global South, is the representation is low, and even when the representation is there, the voice is really small. So as you're saying, because of our dependency, especially economic dependency, then we find it's very difficult for us to actually assert ourselves in any way. And this frustration has come even in small attempts to become sustainable. For example, recently Kenya decided to ban all plastic bags, all plastic bags being used within the country. But because of that, we are seeing a lot of Western influence, those who are responsible for that manufacture of those bags, really frustrating the process. My country, my neighboring country, Tanzania, decided to ban the transportation of second-hand clothing because of emissions and because of trying to empower local communities. But as soon as it did that, then there was a lot of negative feedback from funders, and they had to actually stop that process, and now they're still continuing to import that. So I think there's the frustration from the Global South in that the cycle still continues because sustainability is felt as another political term, and those who have the agency then benefit from having this sustainability discourse, but it's not really from our end geared towards making us better. It's geared towards taking advantage of our lack of development, for that matter, or our need for funding for this development.
Yeah, it's sort of, I ended up putting in the chat when you were talking, I was sort of reflecting, thinking it's almost like it's a new colonialism or crusade in the name of sustainability, which, yeah, it's eye-opening if we think of it that way. And you raised some important points as well about involving people, local users, but also the context that, as you said, we have these universal systems and idea of what sustainability is, but then when you transfer it to another context, it makes absolutely no sense anymore. And actually, we already see some of that even in Europe as well, that we have this transfer of ideas, but at least because climatically, and because also geographically we're less of a, it's easier to move stuff around, it's slightly less of an issue, but it's already an issue. So imagining when we do that even at a broader level as well, and it's some few powerful players who perhaps are deciding what is sustainability. And I think it's very good that you're a powerful voice bringing a discussion to the foreground in this as well, asking that question.
Thank you. Thank you. And just to add again, it's looking at what are the priorities, the local priorities. So for example, I usually say you can't tell somebody to do a green roof when they don't have a roof. You see, so the narrative is more you're pushing for an agenda, yet the basic need is not met. So if there is no roof, then there cannot be a green roof. So it's the local priorities, what would benefit.
And the water and the energy that you talked about as well as the example, but even as you said, and that's also where in the topic of how to make green transition just, that why we really wanted you to talk was that this is usually when in Europe we talk about it, it's about energy poverty, it's about not leaving anybody behind. But at the same time, we are leaving loads of people behind, because you started your talk by saying, ultimately, it's our lifestyles in the West that are causing the climate crisis, that are actually causing the problem. And suddenly you in other countries have to fix a problem that isn't of your making, and you don't have the resources necessarily to do, or then we are even coming in to decide then how you should fix it, and then we create problems in that process. So I think, you know, your view is so useful because it actually opens the whole thing up even wider, beyond our own locality of let's not leave anybody behind when we're actually causing significant harm elsewhere. And we've not been considering that enough or at all. If I perhaps could, on that note, introduce Jonathan. If Jonathan, are you still in the wind and not quite rain, I think? Oh, you've gone, you've got a fake background, you've gone inside, have you?
Yeah, I've gone inside. I'm in a communal hallway. So hopefully people don't slam too many doors, but I think it should be okay. It's better than being, it was really cold and windy outside. So I came inside.
Yeah, it's eastern wind as well. It's called I don't know how warm it is with you, Faith, but it's already just, I don't know what it is today, only 4 or 5 degrees in Finland. So it's, yeah, a lot cooler than where you are. But so without further delay, I'd like to welcome Jonathan. We're very lucky to have Jonathan here today as well, because he's been very booked up to give this talk, coming straight from another workshop. And Jonathan Taylor is a lecturer in sustainable urban development in the Department of Civil Engineering at Tampere University. So he's local in that sense. But he's also an honorary senior research fellow at the UCL Institute of Environmental Design and Engineering in London, the United Kingdom. His research interests are in building physics, modeling of indoor environmental quality and also energy use, and how buildings can impact on occupant health under a range of climate and housing adaptation scenarios. He's authored over 40 journal papers. He was also a contributor to the 2019 and 2020 Lancet Countdown on Climate Change and Health, and also to the United Kingdom's Climate Change Risk Assessment in 2017 and in 2021. So I can see you already sharing the slides. So over to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks. That was a bit of a wordy bio I sent you. I promise you I'm not that important, so I'll just get cracking. So yeah, I was going to talk about climate justice, health, and housing. I'm not an architect, I'm an engineer, so I'm going to be coming at it with a bit of a different angle, maybe. I think that covers some of the screen, but I want to first talk about what we mean by climate justice and some of the ways that I've been thinking about it. So essentially, the causes and impacts of climate change are not born equally or fairly. We've seen that in the past because the climate has already changed, and that's going to continue into the future. Generally, the wealthy around the world have a disproportionate share of global emissions, but also locally. And the poor are far more exposed and vulnerable to the negative impacts of the changing climate. So often when people talk about climate justice, they're talking about a global frame where the developing countries, some of the poor countries, are going to be the ones that are hit the hardest. But you can also see climate justice within countries. And I'm going to talk about some evidence from the developed countries in particular in this talk. But I want to kind of start off by emphasizing that the problems are much more significant in the developing world. So climate change is a health issue. That's really important to understand. There's a whole bunch of different health issues that are going to come up from the changing climate and have already come up. There are going to be issues with food security and the ability to grow food. There are mental health issues associated with the changing climate. There's going to be a greater geographical spread. Things like vector-borne diseases are going to be able to spread further north and south as the climate warms. Many of you will be familiar with the kind of climate projections, which are calling for increased natural disasters, such as flooding and forest fires. But there's also going to be increased exposure to environmental hazards, such as extreme heat, driving rain, or floods. So this past summer in Finland was really, really hot. That's going to be your typical summer in the coming years. So a lot of the work that I do is with health. And I wanted to talk about the triple jeopardy effect, which is a concept in public health, which leads to greater or health disparities across different socioeconomic groups. So say, for example, you've got a wealthy population. They'll have pretty good underlying health because they're able to afford to buy good food. They're able to take holidays. They're able to afford to exercise and have generally positive behaviors, and they're able to live in nice neighborhoods that support that. So they've got a pretty average exposure to hazards. They live in a nice area, it doesn't get too hot, and so they generally have a good quality of life. So that means when something happens, like a heat wave, they've got a relatively low risk of a poor health outcome. Now, we can contrast that with a low-income population. They'll have poor underlying health for a variety of reasons. For example, they'll have issues with chronic stress. They'll have reduced access to healthcare. They'll have less money, so less opportunity for healthy behaviors. And all those things can contribute to really poor underlying rates of health. And I think it's quite remarkable how much sort of stress and financial insecurity does impact an individual's health. They'll be more exposed to hazards, and generally they tend to live in more neglected areas that are less nice, and they're less able to afford to leave. And so that means you've got a relatively high risk of a poor health outcome compared to the wealthier population. We can kind of see this happen in COVID-19. You've got a low-income population. They've got poor underlying health, so they might have some existing health problems. They're more exposed to hazards, so they might be essential workers and they might have to go to work. They might live in overcrowded housing, so they're more exposed to people who might have the virus. And they have a lack of income security, so they actually have to go out into the world and work to make money, and that again exposes them to coronavirus more. So you've got a higher risk of poor health outcome in these low income groups. These are often described generally in terms of being structural determinants of population health. So these aspects which dictate your poor underlying health as well as the increased exposure to hazards. So how does this relate to buildings and climate change? Well, where are the emissions from housing coming from? And this is information from the United Kingdom. It comes from the English Housing Survey. And this is households shown in the figure that have a fireplace, a wood burning fuel, and they use it for heating their house. So solid burning fuel is a significant source of air pollution in developed countries. In London, wood fireplaces are thought to be the biggest source of particulate air pollution, so bigger than cars in industry, is people burning wood fireplaces in their homes. And this chart shows that houses in wealthier areas are far more likely to have open fireplaces and use it. So essentially what it says is that this significant contribution of outdoor air pollution is coming from houses of the wealthy that are burning fireplaces. What about other forms of pollution? What about carbon pollution? So again, there's a big skew in the amount of carbon pollution that's coming from houses, both new houses and existing houses. Wealthier houses consume more energy and their houses have higher estimated annual CO2 emissions. This is because the existing houses tend to be less energy efficient and larger. So particularly in the UK, the wealthier households like to live in the older Victorian dwellings, whereas less wealthy houses are living in some of the, for example, council flats and smaller dwellings that are actually built to a relatively good energy efficiency standard on average. Rather than using the wealth to exceed existing energy standards, the available wealth that people have used to build larger homes. So that's where you see the difference in the newer homes. And even if they live in an inadequate house or an energy inefficient house, they are able to afford to heat it, whereas poorer households are not able to do so. So we know, just looking at the housing stock, that wealthier houses are contributing more to environmental damage. But what about exposures to the climate hazards? Well, the burden from outdoor air pollution in many cities of the world is higher in low-income populations. Sometimes it's U-shaped because you have some wealthy people living in the city center, but generally, on average, it tends to be that poor people have to live, for example, closer to areas of industry or busy roads because the property prices are lower. And air pollution is really serious. It causes around 800,000 premature deaths in Europe a year and around 1,600 in Finland. So it's a big cause of health problems. Lower income housing tends to be more airtight, but that's not enough to offset the differences in outdoor levels. So people are still exposed to higher levels of air pollution indoors. What about heat? Heat's another big climate risk that's going to be increasing in the future. It's increasing average temperatures and the strength and frequency of heat waves. We know in many parts of the world that poor households live in areas with less green space, and in many areas are exposed to higher urban heat island temperatures. So this particular image is from the West Midlands in the UK, but it's been in the news a lot with the United States, and the concept of redlining, where areas in districts where Black people are living have been sort of systematically underdeveloped and are at significantly higher heat risk. Low-income households are also much more likely to work outside during manual labor, and they're less likely to be able to relocate somewhere cooler. What about another climate risk from flooding? So climate change is projected to increase flood risk in many parts of the world. And again, this is from England. Poor households live in areas at a much greater risk of flooding than wealthier communities. So again, the investment to try and reduce flooding risk has been historically targeted towards the wealthier neighborhoods. So what does this have to do with housing and architecture? Housing is supposed to shelter us from the environment, right? Well, not really. So indoor air quality is worse in low-income households. That's because they have poor ventilation. They tend to be smaller, and these smaller volumes more quickly reach high pollution levels. And you get pollution coming from your neighbors when they cook, smoke, and other activities within the building, and they're more likely to live in these buildings that have shared adjoining residences. What about heat? Again, poor households are more likely to live in dwellings without greater overheating risk. So if you look at evidence from the UK, where most houses are naturally ventilated, low-income houses overheat much, much more than higher income houses. And that's because they're smaller. They tend not to be able to have things like as much natural ventilation and cross ventilation, and there's more heat being generated from the neighbors. Also, in many countries like the US, you have a massive discrepancy between the death rates during heat waves between high income and low income populations, because the low income populations are unable to afford air conditioners, or they might not be able to leave for somewhere cooler. In terms of flooding, we know from the UK that low income communities are more likely to have indoor damp and mold, and they're less likely to be able to carry out the repairs due to a lack of money or not owning the property. So a lack of security in the tenancy or the freedom to be able to make repairs. They're much more socially vulnerable to floods too. So you might not be able to afford insurance, or you might not be able to afford to replace your possessions. And so when there's flooding in a low income community, the health effects are much, much more. So back to this image here, we have a low income population. We have poor underlying health, again, for various reasons. We're more exposed to hazards because they live in poor neighborhoods and their houses are less well adapted to climate. So there's a high risk of a poor health outcome. And of course, if something does happen, they'll have lower resilience and less ability to recover. That's covered, but as we've seen from COVID-19, climate change also is going to hit the poorest the hardest. And so COVID-19 is a bit of a microcosm for what we're going to see in the future with climate change. So what can architects do for climate justice? So I'm going to introduce the concept, you may well know it, but of planetary health. So the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends. So that's both the health of the population, but also global health. Architects have a really important role in planetary health. So buildings account for around 36% of the EU's carbon emissions. They use about 50% of all extracted material and produce about 35% of the total waste in the EU. So you have a key ethical responsibility as architects. You need to design equitable buildings which do not compromise the health of the planet. And since I'm so involved with health these days, I thought about maybe, do we need to revisit the idea of taking some kind of an architect's oath and then basing it somewhat on the Hippocratic oath that the doctors need to take? So one of the first things in the Hippocratic oath that many people know is first, don't do no harm. How would an architect do no harm? Well, you have to make sure that buildings have function over form. You need to renovate instead of new builds. You have to increase retrofit rates, particularly among the groups who've not historically done that. You need to use sustainable materials. You need to avoid putting fireplaces in the buildings that you're designing and prioritizing clean energy. And you need to design buildings to be resilient to future climates, because the historical climate that we've designed buildings for doesn't exist anymore. Another part of the Hippocratic Oath is, remember that I do not treat a fever chart, a cancerous growth, but a sick human being whose illness may affect the person's family and economic stability. So you're building buildings for people. And I think it's important to remember the element of equity. Everybody is human, and we need to treat people equally. So low-cost housing cannot be low-quality housing. In fact, it might even need to be better because you're dealing with a really vulnerable population. You also need to prioritize equitable solutions to things like heat. That would include passive measures of district cooling instead of inequitable solutions like air conditioning, which rely on somebody being able to afford to run it and operate it or install it. And there are some references. So yeah, any questions?
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Again, quite a lot of information in a short space. I don't see any immediate questions yet in the chat, but can I maybe check in with Faith and also Inari if they have any immediate questions, and Raul as well. And meanwhile, maybe some people would like to ask a few things. But thank you for including some more practical things. And I never thought of it the Hippocratic Oath, because architects in most countries do sign up to a code of conduct, but it sort of take account of or be aware of the environmental impact is quite different from the oath that you're describing here. I can see Steve would like to ask a question, but perhaps first I'll check in if Faith is still around or Inari have any questions. Otherwise we'll move and ask Steve to unmute.
I mean, no immediate questions, but I think I also like the idea of do no harm, because I think if we thought about it that way, whatever we design, if we thought about what implication it has on the people, in this case with regards to their health, and broadly in regards to well-being, and even do no harm to the environment, then I think it will be a really good place to start. So that's very interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, and the naming also of the term planetary health, right? I think is also, I think could really sort of bring home this sort of impact that we have on the planet and on other people. It broadens it out rather than, my building is not harming the occupants of the building. Suddenly the planetary health makes it gives a much bigger picture. Yeah. It's a bit hard sharing and also trying to make notes at the same time. I would want to tweet some of this, but I can't multitask that well. Inari, did you have any immediate thoughts or questions you wanted to share?
Maybe I could ask the same question as I asked from Faith, or kind of like I'm always inspired by practical examples. So if there's good examples to point out where kind of some of the issues, maybe not all, would have been solved.
Yeah, I tend to focus on the negative. So I don't know if I have any practical examples. There's some really good examples, I think, about how they're changing some of the way that they're existing areas, like the superblock concept in Barcelona, the idea of this Nordic superblock, which I think was going to include some low-income housing as well. So areas of mixed housing where you're designing, energy efficient and sort of well-built buildings where you have communal sources of heat and cool. I think they're doing it quite well in some areas in Finland. Yeah.
I think it's always easier actually, Jonathan, to talk about as academics, especially what doesn't work, right? As then how to fix it is often much harder, especially in something as complex as a built environment. And I think you were also showing these connections and interrelationships between different aspects. If I can quickly say that, I think let's use the chat. Today's theme is about how can we create a green transition. I think we've heard several ideas already that go all the way from some practical things we can do in architecture, in our building designs, but perhaps also our attitudes, our own values. So let's start populating the chat, if you don't mind. But I can see Rob has his hand up, but perhaps Steve was first. So Steve.
Thank you, Chair. I'm afraid my point is roughly the same. The architecture that Jonathan was talking about is only about one species, whereas the architecture prior to, so most agriculture, or rather, let's have a think now. The buildings, the farm buildings a while ago, the Palladian palaces in Italy were for horses and other animals, as well as, of course, the wealthy, but also the farmhands and all the rest of them. And so you had a building that housed the whole community and the livestock that they relied upon to keep their community going. Now, none of that features in modern architecture. It's all about how can humankind live regardless of all other species. Now, I'll keep quiet, but it's that question that's still hanging in the air, or rather, it's the absence of answers to that question, which isn't even a question. It's if we don't, but unless we address that, we're not going to survive. And yet again, that was the point that was being teased out during the European Enlightenment. They got flattened when everybody said, the rich said, well, we know better than nature. We can finesse nature. You can't finesse nature. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's some ways to. So I would argue maybe that things like livestock isn't quite nature, because if you look at the biomass breakdown of Earth, we've got almost as many sort of cows in terms of mass as we have people, and a very, very small amount of in terms of mammalian of wild animals. So I think like that's something that's in many ways it's a human invention trying to provide shelter for the animals that are really important for your survival and your sort of livelihood. In terms of actually integrating nature into buildings, I think that's we're making some foray into that in many parts of the world with things like green roofs. Sometimes it's just kind of a bit of greenwashing, but sometimes they do work in practice, and those can have big impacts in terms of providing space for biodiversity, but also mitigating the urban heat island. So if you start putting green roofs on buildings, you start making cities less hot, and that can reduce your exposure during heat wave events. Similar with flooding, you get more green space, you're able to have natural sources of drainage, and you're less reliant on human built drainage systems.
Okay, we have now Robert, please.
Thank you. I arrived late, so I only caught the end of the last talk, which was excellent, and this talk as well. I just wanted to you said that new build and standards and things are better than old buildings, etc., etc. Have you studied? Are you talking about that over time? Because if the new build buildings perform extremely well, but are going to be replaced in 25 years' time, or need to be constantly maintained, versus a building that is not has been here for 150 years and will be here for another couple of 100 years. Are you modeling that into it? And I think there's something here as well about tolerance and behavior. So my grandparents lived in a Victorian house and they never had the heating on, and the answer would always be, well, I'll put a jumper on, or yeah, it's cold, deal with it. So there's a thing here about tolerance. There's a thing here about comfort. There's a thing here about behavior, which I think is absolutely critical in this discussion. So obviously the important debate at the moment about insulate now and all the rest of it, but all that stuff has energy that's going to be used in transportation, energy that's used for extraction, energy that's used for installation, etc., etc., etc. When certain things can be addressed with comfort. So I think it's a balance between fabric of buildings, design, etc., etc., and also expectation, comfort, behaviour, and stuff that we've got used to only over the last several decades or last couple of 100 years, that really we were never used to that in the first place, and it isn't an unsustainable model. The second thing is the Hippocratic Oath side, which is really interesting and goes beyond where we sit in terms of professional ethics and stuff like that, which is really interesting. However, we sit in an industry which is not medicine, right? We sit in property and construction, which has massive issues. And if we're going to address it, we can't just address it from architecture. We've got to do a root and branch of the entire process, from the very beginning to the very end. And I think, that's the only way to do that. And it goes beyond architects. We tend to be much more vocal, or some of us, on these issues, but it has to be all of those stakeholders in that process, not just one of the professions. It's got to be engineers, it's got to be building surveyors, it's got to be RICS, it's got to be the contractors. It has to be all of those people kind of pulling together and pushing something where there is no other option than to to sign up to these things. So yeah, so I'm interested in your views on how you're addressing this stuff in terms of over time, right? And that's also the humans and others in that consideration, in that Hippocratic Oath, not just those currently, but those that come in the generations to come, but also the complexity as well, not just looking at something in a defined way, when really it has a knock-on in a number of other things, and exploring the complexity and the over time bit, the temporal bit, in terms of how you're modeling these things, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of sort of the life cycle cost, the first thing that you mentioned, we don't really account for that. Right. So of course, a building that's been built many, many years ago, really probably in the UK, super energy efficient. The modern ones are built to increasingly strict energy standards starting from like the 1940s and onwards. And so they're naturally going to have less energy consumption. And then the modern buildings that are being built now are not particularly strict requirements, but they are, better in that term. So yeah, that's strictly what I was talking about there, was the energy performance of buildings. In terms of the energy required to sort of retrofit them, I agree. Like, I don't know if we have a good idea of how much that's going to cost. And in terms of the intensity and the types of materials that you use to do that, there's a lot of complicated questions, particularly in the UK with all the solid walled buildings and how that might work. So yeah, I don't have an answer for that just yet, but the idea was to show that I think particularly with the new buildings that are being built, they're still, because of the size differential, having a larger environmental impact than the smaller ones. In terms of the adaptation, I think you're absolutely right. I grew up in a house where my parents refused to turn the thermometer up during the winter. So yeah, I think there's a lot of scope for just putting on a sweater. Hot weather is a little bit harder. You can only take off so many clothes, so it's a bit more difficult to adapt to that. And I think we also need to acknowledge that some people are really vulnerable to the temperature variation. So there are segments of the population that might need to keep it within a relatively narrow temperature band. And maybe that's just having special requirements like they do for retirement homes or nursing homes. But that's something that I really strikes me about now living in Finland, is that there's a really, really low tolerance for high or low temperatures, and temperatures are maintained within a super low temperature band. And I think really we could save a lot of energy by reducing the temperatures in the dwellings. There was the Hippocratic Oath thing was the next. I have to completely admit, I'm not an architect. I don't have a plan with that. It was just an analogy that I wanted to draw that sort of along the lines with the planetary health. You know, health doctors have an oath that they take. Architects have a code of conduct, but maybe, you know, maybe if we start thinking about things in terms of planetary health, there's an analogy there where you can sort of say, well, we won't do any harm, and we'll recognize that the buildings that we're building for are, you know, for people, and they're all should be treated equitably.
Okay.
If I could perhaps quickly jump in on the issue of wearing the extra jumper or taking one off. I think that, and I definitely grew up like that in a fuel poor household in Belgium. But I do think that the risk is that if we actually have all our buildings that are better performing, then that is in itself much more just. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you actually don't have a very high energy expense. And also the environmental impact is massively reduced. And I think we always have to be careful about sort of, we can nudge people to behave a certain way, and we can suggest ways of you know, saving energy. But as Jonathan also said, that some people might find it difficult to do some of that. But also, I think if we just have better buildings, then actually they are more robust to these different behaviors. And also, you know, for different kinds of people who will live in them, because you might live in a home and you're perfectly happy to do that, but in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, UK news at the moment about rising energy prices. So people that were not in fuel poverty might now be in fuel poverty as well. And I think it comes back perhaps a little bit with some of Faith's kind of, I'm just reflecting between the two talks and some of it, well, several connections, but in a way, Faith was also sort of if I understood you correctly, one of the points was also, Faith, you were making was about, we have to be very careful about these universal approaches, right? While you're on field work, but and I see that this is quite similar in many ways as well, whereby we have to again be careful to not sort of make homes universally acceptable to everybody, universally the same, because then we might not please anybody. So I'm also very conscious of what I'm saying is all the buildings should be well performing, but then I think there still needs to be enough flexibility within that. But as I said, research is showing that well performing low energy buildings, they're still very robust to different uses of behavior. And I think we just have to be careful about sort of universal solutions, and particularly pulling them across different climates and different regions as well, or solutions from one to the other, particularly in a changing climate as well.
Yeah. So I think if there is no now more question, we can go for our next speaker, and we can have the last 15-20 minutes, no, for address this discussion in the chat. So our next speaker is Inari Birkala. Is an architect by background and worked on the EU Foundation as a project manager for new construction. The EU Foundation offers rental homes for people experiencing homelessness and those who are under a threat of becoming homeless. And one of the key targets of the new strategy is a fair transition toward carbon neutrality living. So please, Inare, it's over to you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Raul and Sophie, for the opportunity for telling about the work of Y Foundation. Yes, so I'm an architect by background, but then working now for almost a year for the Y Foundation. And where the name comes from for the letter Y is the Finnish word together, which is yhdessä. And it used to be alone, yksin, but then recently it has been changed into Yhdessä Foundation. And that's a non-profit foundation that's 35 years and founded to stop or end moving to Y Foundation was working also as a practicing architect, and somebody mentioned the course Interplay of Cultures in the chat. So we also kind of what was this Khao Klang Youth Center realized in Phnom Penh, and I think there's a long discussion to be having of the good sides and bad sides of this project. And of course there was a lot of idealism and also the issue of white saviorism in kind of this kind of approach, but also trying to address the local climatic conditions, and then finding an attractive way of using kind of materials as bamboo, considered very cheap, and then for example in the terrace parts of the buildings having or like making the most out of natural ventilation. So kind of that, and then working with a little bit similar projects and kind of smaller installations as the pavilion building that's on the Topper building, and also having a small company together with a friend, Sofia, pictured there in the picture, but then also working for Finnish companies and a construction company in between. But then thinking who bears the responsibility of sustainability of architectural projects, or who has the ability to have an impact. There was recently a study made by the Finnish Association of Real Estate Owners, and the question, I apologize for the slides being mostly, there's a lot of slides in Finnish, but I'll translate them to you. There was a question like who is responsible or who gets to impact the choices concerning the low carbon or the carbon footprint of a building, and as it was considered, so the developer is of course in charge of the financial decisions, then gets to kind of impact on the decision. So in that sense, I'd also like to encourage many of you architects and engineers listening or kind of trying to find positions also working as a developer, because there is really where hopefully you'll be able to also impact these issues. And this is also another study of thinking kind of which project phases influence carbon impacts of projects, and then kind of like who acts on these different phases of a project and who decides. So then it is like the big role of the developer that has on the decisions. And even though there are project phases that are driven by the designer, but still the developer has so I think also for architects it's not for sure we should use all the tools that we have within our hands, but also we need kind of other sectors in the built environment to along board with us. So with Y Foundation, this is quickly the main number. So it has 18,000 apartments across Finland, and 800 are being built at the moment. There's been 300 of the residents who've actively taken part in the events during last year. It was founded 1985, has 6 offices and close to 200 employees. And it's like a self-sustaining foundation, and it's non-profit. So kind of, and it was founded all like Finnish parties coming together 35 years. And trying to tackle the issue of homelessness, which was then very, very critical also in Finland. And what I think is been really successful, that it was such a widely, or like all the kind of actors in the build sector. There's, for example, the builders union, but then also the representative of the building companies that are both still also part of the board of Y Foundation. So you have kind of the union, but then also the companies represented in the board. And this was what kind of the first shelter for homelessness in Ruoholahti, called Lepakko, was not 35 years ago, but then kind of before, from Finland. And the idea from Y Foundation has been the housing first, so kind of from moving from the idea of solving homelessness with shelters in the more of providing homes. So kind of housing first. So in order to get your life under your own control, or kind of being able, it's not really that the apartment is something that you're given as a price for example, stopping alcohol, like overuse of alcohol or drugs or something, but it's kind of that you need the home first, and that's when you're really able to build your life. So kind of moving from this to this, and then like providing a home for everybody. And then also of kind of with the whole approach of moving from guards to support workers, and also providing other kinds of support, and then also kind of maybe not like trying to find I think the picture is also representing of finding a even level of working with. And now I can't see the chat, so if there's any questions that are directly with the topics, then please just raise your hand and I'll try to answer. But so the homelessness in Finland, it's really during the 35 years that we and other actors have been working on it. It has been like diminishing a lot. So and that's the final goal of ending also homelessness. And Finland has been a good example of this. So according to some statistics in the EU, Finland has been the only country where the number of homelessness is on the decline. Of course, it's demanded a big financial investments, but still the results are quite remarkable. Of housing first. Housing is a human right. Everybody has their own lease agreement. Then first housing, and then you're really then solving other problems. Providing support, recovery orientation, and then also living where the others are living too. So kind of supporting communality within the projects. What the projects look like, there's this is a recently finished project in Tampere, and this was also especially provided for musicians. So because it's affordable housing and supported by ARA, there's an income limit for people who can apply to live in these buildings, and then this one was especially, or it was like a house for musicians that could apply to live in the building. Then there's supporting units where there's also partners. For example, here is the Salvation Army, who's kind of Y Foundation has built the building, and then it's Salvation Army who's kind of running the activities in the building. And then also there's 2 wooden projects that Y Foundation has built. This was in the first one in Jyväskylä. And then this is interesting in that sense that it's a solid wood wall. So it doesn't actually have a wooden coating outside. So it's kind of like a low-tech solutions, which is also a little bit interesting to see how it will survive in the Finnish weather, but how it's been tackled is that there's an extra layer. So if you need to, for example, sand, or that's not the right word, but kind of get rid of the outer layer of the building, then the wall is thick enough to handle that. But it's also with U values, because the 0.17 is usually the limit in Finland. So this one's actually 0.49, and it has quite high energy consumption, the building. So we are still surveying how does it actually behave. That's where the apartments are, or the apartments in Finland. So they're all around Finland. Most of them are in Helsinki, but then also in other parts of Finland. And that's kind of how it functions financially. So the revenue or the rents from the apartments is really kind of that's running it and also funding the constructions of the new buildings. Then there are some grants from STEA, but this is going to be, as maybe you followed the discussion of Veikkaus in Finland. So this one will surely get a lot smaller. And then there's also the loans, or the ARA loans, which are used for funding and repairing the buildings. Some other statistics. Usually when people think of homelessness, then you think of people sleeping on the streets, but in Finland it's mostly of homeless people who are living temporarily with friends or relatives, and then kind of people having to stay in, or like rough sleepers or shelters and institutions. That's luckily a minority, but still still not a good situation as it's now. Most of the homeless, or statistically, people are considered homeless. Homeless in Finland, then 3/3 that are men, and 3/4 that are men, and 1/4 that's women. But the women are a special case in that sense that then with men the amount of homeless people is going down, but then women it has been even increasing. So there's that's like there was a special study who tried to look for those reasons where that's coming from, and that's kind of the idea of housing first as a kind of providing supported housing of flats, and then going down with the needs of beds in emergency shelters for because I think the real solution is providing a home, and then also financially how this is the presentations made for municipalities, so kind of showing that it's also economically wise to provide the flats. Then thinking of solutions for homelessness, there was recently in the European or the new European Bauhaus prizes. So one of the prizes was awarded for an idea or a solution tackling homelessness, and I was really happy that they were also writing about housing first and kind of that kind of approach. But often I think, for example, I was studying when the design, like You Give a Damn books were published by the Architects of Humanity, and then often the solutions provided for homeless, or like architects or architect students for homeless, are like kind of these kind of like temporary shelters. So here it's like a modular housing, but then I'd like to question like what actually is a homeless person, or that's not really something like a stable part of a person in a way. So like kind of why should a homeless person be sheltered or like housed in a certain way, or like why shouldn't the homes for homeless people be like every building in the city, or like kind of I think there's not such a thing as a homeless person that would need like a certain kind of building type. So that it's like that's, I think it's often you see like this kind of quick approaches from architects to this problem, but I think there shouldn't be a difference. The big thing now with Y Foundation is the strategy, and the thing that I've been now working for a year, trying to find a way of a fair transition towards carbon neutral living. So one of the three most important strategic goals for the foundation, and Y Foundation has declared that our goal to be is carbon neutral by 35, so the same as Finland, and then having our emissions go down by 70% by 2030. But this has proven to be super difficult. I'll show you a few examples a little bit later. But I think Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, has a good slide, or like kind of where we've discussed of the definition of sustainability, or like if a long term, they used to always say that there's like these three pillars of sustainability, like social, economical, ecological, that should also be kind of supported together. But I think Sitra is putting this really, really well in this triangle. So kind of like when we aim to produce well-being, it has to be supported by the economy, but within the kind of environmental boundaries. So they are not like individual goals by themselves, but kind of like a system. So like kind of the environmental sustainability can't really be or like that's not the goal, but that's kind of the definite limit that we have to follow. And I think if thinking, for example, the donut economics, I think the donut economics is actually kind of that triangle kind of turned, or like it's kind of the layers in the donut, I think is kind of those same ones. I think a Finnish research project called ORSI, they're doing really good work on kind of in the scale of government. So like how, and I think this is a really good example of the previous pictures also with Y Foundation. So kind of we have found a way of producing well-being, and also in Finland is kind of social, achieving a lot of social targets, but then also stepping a lot of planetary boundaries, as you also see in the donut model. So kind of like no country in the world. I think this might be Bhutan that's closest to the eco welfare state where should be heading. How we've approached the thing in Y Foundation is by starting to calculating our carbon footprint. And I don't know of how many of you are, or if this is new or very using, but we've been using the greenhouse gas protocol model for that. And then also understanding where the footprint of the building comes from. I think that for me, this makes it a lot easier to understand. So thinking of a life cycle of a building, which definitely should be longer than 60 years, but kind of that there's the really big carbon footprint of the materials and the transportation and site construction, and then kind of like every year within the use of the building, there is both the footprint of the energy use. Maybe we can cut it when we are moving for more sustainable energy production, but then there's also going to be those like repairs that you need to do within the lifetime of a building. The carbon neutral, like then looking at the goal of Finland of being carbon neutral by 2035, and looking at kind of where it comes from and how also how does it look for a developer or a company or like a real estate company. And then this is sketch, so it's an ongoing work, but there's the green is the energy use of Y Foundation, the blue is the building of the new apartments, and then kind of how we should go from the current state, which is maybe somewhere between 30,000 tons of CO2 emissions per year, and then going to the carbon neutrality of 35, of finding a balance between the things that are under the line and on top of the line, and what actually is a kind of, for example, how much solar energy can we produce in the building. So like if we even have things or our wooden buildings calculated to be under the line. Then we also calculated the carbon footprint for all of the buildings. So there was 8 new buildings that were built last year, and the total carbon footprint was close to 9,000 tons of CO2 for the construction emissions. So if you know the calculation method for with the A1 to A5 phase. And so how does the kind of going from the current stage of 9,000 tons of carbon to being neutral in 35, it's this was what it would look kind of in numbers, and the different colors are, so the blue is for the construction, then the green is for the site, and pink is for parking solutions, so kind of where it consists of our emissions from construction. So that's the updated calculation method from the Ministry of the Ministry of Environment in Finland. So what does it then mean? This is very much under work. Hopefully it's going to be brought forward. But then, as you see from the numbers, or like kind of the wooden out of the 8 projects that were completed last year, there was 1 that was made out of wood, and the total like emissions even for the wooden building wouldn't be enough, or Y Foundation has a goal to reach our targets of providing more homes, of building 500 new flats per year. But now it seems that even with wooden buildings, we can't achieve that, or kind of that the emission target that we have is only for kind of 5 new buildings or 250 new flats per year, which we would be able to build with that kind of emission. So now kind of the goals in the strategy, so we can't really keep on building the homes that we've promised or we've aimed to do. Then where the fund, or like kind of the loans for the building comes from ARA, the Finnish Housing Finance and Development Center of Finland. So they're backing up all the loans in Finland, and they have super strict limits of what building can cost. So for example, for Y Foundation, there's we have our design guidance, so kind of all of the projects. So there's like kind of divisions, and this is kind of how the real estate companies or most of the developers in Finland work, so that they have the design guide by themselves and very technical instructions. So for us, as the main goal for the materials, and this is all work that was done before I started working for the foundation, is that we should work, it's been durability, or the maximum durability of the materials. And now it's, for example, defined that all the floorings in the new building should be either laminate or vinyl planks, or both materials that can be recycled, and both containing PVC. But thinking of prices, or like what would be a more sustainable material for the floors, for example, wood would still be more durable. And at the moment, when we are getting most of the funding for the construction from ARA, the limit for building is so strict. So it's not like kind of we can't act in a more sustainable way, because the limit for what kind of what our construction is supposed to cost, we can't really make these more durable solutions. And this is, of course, something that we have brought up with ARA, but it's a discussion where it goes. But I hope maybe today they'll have some ideas or solutions for this. Sophie, what do you think? There's few more things, but has it already been too much information for one day, or should I go on? There's a few more slides.
We do have a few questions for you, but if maybe 1 or 2 minutes, just wrap up, and then we can go through these questions. If that's okay.
No. Yeah, I kind of now also other questions that I think with carbon neutrality, for example, are looking at the emissions of the state of Finland. So they are roughly like 50 to 60 megatons of carbon. But then, for example, looking at Finnish companies, so Fortum, who owns the German Uniper. So only the emissions from Fortum that's owned by the Finnish state, only Fortum's emissions themselves are 60 million tons per year. So kind of the government of Finland gets kind of all the profits from producing all these emissions, but then does it really, but doesn't really include these emissions in our calculation. So kind of, I think, when approaching carbon neutrality, then we should definitely be lot more honest what our well-being is now based on this big deficit. Another thing which I find is really important is another real estate company, Ylva, owned by the students of the university in Helsinki. So not only by calculating their annual carbon footprint, they've also calculated their carbon depth. So kind of during all the buildings that they have built, and since the end of the 19th century, kind of like how much carbon they've produced as a company during that time. And I think kind of like this is when we have to go first to zero, but then also to carbon negative to kind of take back all this carbon. But I haven't seen any other real estate operator to be as honest as Ylva also about the depth that you've made just by building the buildings that you own. Then it's again also the footprint, or the annual average footprint of a Finnish person, and then as a housing provider, they are kind of looking at the emissions coming from the living, or the red part. But should we also try to find ways to support our residents with the other parts of the footprint? And this is a research project that we are now working, which is also, it's called biodiversity building. And the idea is kind of also both looking if there's a ways that the kind of within a scale of construction project, there's something that we can also try to do of tackling the biodiversity loss, but also supporting our residents of kind of with the other parts of the carbon footprint, or supporting them kind of, or enabling them to live as sustainably as they would maybe want at the moment, which might not be possible in more traditional buildings. So, for example, providing possibilities of farming your own food, and then also trying to preserve the ground. So then yeah, but this is a research project that's recently started, but we're going to publish a mid-report of this one tomorrow with the reference study. So that should be in the website by the end of tomorrow. Yeah, sorry, maybe too much information for one presentation, but yeah, I'll open the chat and let's see.
Thank you so much. First though, before we go into questions, Faith has to leave quite shortly, I think sort of now. So Faith, if you're still there, I just wanted to say thank you so much. There's actually quite some interesting bits in the chat that we can share with you later, unless you've had the chance to look at it. But quite a few people were commenting on this sort of colonization actually through our sustainable solutions, not only our pollution, but also then through some of the things that you've been describing and like the wind farm projects as well that are happening. And I think Emil was saying in Zanzibar with an EU or other kind of World Bank funding and, you know, actually creating more problems than solving issues. So, but we will save the chat as well and get that to you. But I hope that our paths will cross again. I will make sure they do. I just want to say bye at this moment to Faith, who has to continue with the field work as well. But thank you so much for joining us and your precious time. I mean, that's for all the speakers, but I think especially for Faith all the way from Kenya to join us. And no doubt we will hear and see more of Faith's work as well. So just if everybody could maybe switch on the cameras if you're happy with this and wave at Faith from wherever. A lot of us are in Finland, not necessarily, but yeah, just
thank you,
bye
Faith.
basically. And thank you so much. So thank you. I'll be in touch.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'll be around a little longer as I wait for my transport, so I'll still be in the background, but thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, okay, well, it's good that we said bye to you anyway. So, of course, if you did have any question for Inari while you're still here, and then also Jonathan as well, then we can open that up first. But otherwise, there's a couple of questions already for Inari. Jonathan?
All right, no, I'm all right, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Jonathan, any media questions from you?
I'm tempted to throw it back of you. If you can, you've given a number of positive examples in terms of practical solutions, and it was a really good talk. Thank you very much. I'm wondering about whether there's any sort of thought for planning for climate adaptation, or to, you know, what kind of yeah, whether there's any adaptation involved in the designing and constructing of the buildings, or positive examples of that, if you have any.
Very good question, because it's also very much about the just transition. It's not just about the here and now, but of course, very much what you were talking about as well, Jonathan, which is already what's happening, going to be happening, and more of it. And how do we plan for that? Yeah. Good.
Not directly, no, that we would have. Of course, when the kind of the big renovations, for example, with all the techniques, you try to improve those, but not directly any solutions. Maybe something that has arisen from the research project of the biodiversity building is an idea within the company to look at our existing, so Y Foundation has maybe 300 buildings all around Finland. So kind of looking at the yards and the gardens and the spaces of those. So for example, because it's been very typical that there's only the lawn and not much else. So kind of also like considering the biodiversity aspect. So that's something that's kind of now coming, but with not so much for sure with the heat, or like kind of kaukokylmä, or like district cooling would be very energy efficient. So kind of, but probably studying those in Helsinki where that's available in the future, or like when renovations, if that's something to install, but nothing that would have been done yet with us.
Okay, thanks.
Steve, you have your hand up.
Yeah, how are architects engaging in the COP26 preparations collectively, or aren't they? I mean, I'm quite involved in all the preparations from a trade union point of view, and I'm an engineer.
The RIBA is doing, has got a summit actually alongside it. So they have the Royal Institute of British Architects have organized a summit, and some of the projects that are being presented are also international. And then of course ACAN are hopefully ACAN International are doing some actions as well, but that's of course kind of voluntary. And actually tomorrow ACAN have a national strike day. If you go onto their website, maybe Raul can quickly look it up and say something, but it's tomorrow, Friday 24th. It's because of climate or earth.
No, I beg your pardon. I wasn't so much talking about the protest. We can all protest, but the transition isn't just about saying this has got to stop. It's the bit that's missing is, and what have we got to do instead? And that certainly includes architects.
Yes, I was just throwing ACAN in because I suddenly got reminded that, oh, actually there is an action tomorrow. Well, they are of course lobbying at the Royal Institute of British Architects, but I don't know what's happening in other countries or even in Finland at the moment, but and how to reach the policymakers, of course. But there is in the UK, there is actually going to be a summit alongside Glasgow activities that are happening from the Royal Institute of British Architects, but it is at the lobbying level. And of course, I think a lot of the architecture institutes are actually, and Inari, I don't know what you know about this in Finland, also SAFA here, people are gearing up towards a green transition, but it is still a slow process for what really needs to change, in my point of view.
We don't have much time, so slowness isn't anyway, but I don't want to tread in your toes. I beg your pardon. Yeah.
No. It's good that you bring this out. That we're talking about how to do things, and then we're still talking about it rather than doing it, right? Yeah. And I think Inari's talk quite nicely showed some of these tensions about you get funding, and that limits your options, and that immediately limits how sustainable the building is. So that there's also mismatch between policy making and funding versus then what's happening on the ground as well. I mean, one of the things that also struck me as well, when you have the timber building you talked about, that's a solid block timber, right? So what the Ministry of Environment have allowed is that they don't have to be as well insulated. So they don't perform much better because you're using all the timber and you've got the embodied carbon, it's a local material. Sorry, Inari, jump in.
It's energy class B, so it's been compensated because my colleague has built the building, so then kind of course he wanted to test that solid wood structure. So then there's like a thicker insulation in the roof, so that so it's and then there's also the heat recovery from the wastewater. So kind of the bad walls have been compensated with other kinds of measures, and then also but
it's still, as you said, there's still a higher energy use. You know, the whole U values, and particularly in cold countries, quite astonishing. So it's well intended, but then the unintended consequence for me struck me was this tension when we talk about a just green transition, that we have a greener building, lower carbon, and it performs much better from an ecological point of view. But then actually for already a vulnerable group, financially vulnerable group, then actually the energy bills might be higher, so, or they're colder. So it's sort of this, and I think this is sort of a very good example of a non-just green transition that is unintentional, it's not intended. It's just that that's one of those things that we can do in policy, and even as designers, we do the best we can with the building, and it's all within the regulations, but actually then it has these other negative, kind of more negative consequences. Of course, people are not on the street, that's still better than being on the street and other issues, but I think it's that tension and that sort of part of that just transition that is very challenging, I think. And I thought that was, and also the floor finishes was a very good example of these tensions that you're facing. Emma, and if you want to unmute and ask a question, I don't know if I pronounced your name right at all, so I'm sorry if I didn't.
It's totally okay. It's Emel, yeah.
Oh, that sounded the same to me, but I'm so sorry. Yeah.
It's you are pronouncing it okay.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Go for your question.
Actually, I had a comment on your question, Sophie, of how local people and communities could benefit and avoid displacement, at least in Finland, like in rural areas, that this is a real problem at the moment, that all of the services are going away to the city centers and so on. And there has been some kind of like, you know, probably degrowth economy movement and so on. There are some movement going on around that area, and social co-ops. I'm not sure if that's the right word. I mean osuuskunnat in Finnish, but you know, there is this osuuskuntalaki, like social co-op law, which kind of permits, like it's a company law that permits this kind of companies that are able, like, that are not that are kind of concentrating on services and not on growth, not on economic growth. So it's kind of a mixture between societies and companies. And that's actually, like, in Finnish setting is one way to go and create new democratic level of community movement.
Yeah, okay, thank you. It'd be interesting to hear more about that, because I'm not so familiar with that in Finland and how that actually works. But so if I understand correctly, it's both local people that are able to work together with them companies and keep some of the services or facilities, rather than in degrowth areas. It's sort of downhill. Did I understand correctly from what you were suggesting, that there's models, different models of organization?
Yeah, there are different models of organization, and like there are different kind of these social co-ops already existing, and some of them are more like companies, and some of them are like societies. And the point that I meant was that the degrowth movement and also Green New Deal movement, if you know about these ecological economic theories, social co-op law is really, like, it goes really well with these theories, and that's an interesting way for urban planning. Like if you're doing urban planning, then it's an interesting aspect to think of. Well, I'm doing my master's thesis about this. So yeah,
maybe you can give a presentation at some point, actually. Yeah, well, thank you for pointing us in that direction. I can see also Sampa has a question. I have some questions in the chat first, perhaps. Some questions which included from Sampa was about retrofitting. Inari, is there any plans, or do you have any buildings that will need refurbishing or are being refurbished?
All the time. I think it's maybe 15 projects that are being renovated every year, but most of the like a big majority of Y Foundation's apartments have been built in the 90s, so they don't really so a retrofitting where you'd, for example, improve the insulations in the walls. So that's usually kind of something that's financially viable only with the kind of really big renovation that you do in the age of 40 or 50 years of the building. And kind of majority of the buildings have been built in the 90s, so then they don't really need this yet. So there's, for example, now like one big building where they're doing it, but thing that they're doing more and more is trying to find ways of moving into renewable energy. So for example, already 5 years ago, they've changed all the oil heaters into geothermal heat, and now also it's going to be more solar energy or solar panels that are being installed, and especially the solar panels work really well if you have geothermal energy, because then you can provide the electricity for the heat pumps needed for those. So they've done more like technical installations, but kind of the like real retrofits or like improving insulation, that's something that you do only, or financially it kind of is possible only to do with the really big renovations.
And which is very interesting, because Jonathan, you might want to jump in as well, because it does relate a bit with some of your work as well. And one of the things we often mention is that it's a little strange to renew systems when then you have a leaky or an energy inefficient building, because of course that's it's a little bit also Faith was saying energy efficiency first, which can be easy, but then perhaps more expensive. And if there's especially no incentives for that as well. So in a way, that also is in a way a tension somewhat, because that will make it harder, quicker to meet your carbon emissions. And of course, one of the things of ACAN, and we heard this in the very first talk by Tom Bennett, is that while we need to reduce carbon and we have all these targets for 2050 in Finland by 2035, we actually need to reduce carbon now because it stays 100 years in the atmosphere. So it sort of delays that. We might have these projections, but actually it's really about reducing it now as much as possible immediately. And you have then these tensions with then sort of the financial long-term kind of both short-term decisions, but also long-term investments as well. But I don't know if Jonathan is still there and wants to jump in on that, but otherwise there you are.
Oh, no, I think that's a good point. I think that's kind of a difference between a lot of the Finnish systems where they have this very mechanical systems, whereas a lot of other countries don't have this focus. But I think it's really cool, interesting to see the district cooling coming up and people choosing to do geothermal cooling as well when they're doing these big plumbing renovations. So you kind of are seeing not just energy renovations, but also some larger climate adaptation at the same time.
We haven't done it, but I now recently heard that the Helsinki city, like the affordable housing company Heka or ATT, they are testing it now in Kalastama.
Yeah, it's a good solution, I think, because it's not dependent on being able to afford to buy it yourself and install it and run it on your own electricity bill. So,
but still, passive measures should go first. Otherwise, good luck trying to cool when you have all the 24 hours of sun practically. Not quite in Helsinki, but anyway. But Sampa, maybe this is, if we have no other questions, this is your opportunity to take the floor.
Yeah, well, I would like to a little bit continue about like retrofitting idea, asking from Inari. So I was thinking about your goal of you also want to build more housing, but at the same time lower the emissions. So I was thinking, is there any like plans or ideas to retrofit existing buildings, for example, vacant office buildings or anything like that for housing purposes, because this would then maybe help you with the emission goals.
That would be a very wise decision, I think, kind of like looking at that graph. Like I think my boss hasn't realized it yet that we simply can't build as much as our targets are, but the retrofitting, I think, would be like kind of like with the climate target being set, we can't absolutely build because it doesn't fit with the climate target. So the retrofitting would definitely be the solution. But then again, at the current funding or the loans and the ARA limits for maximum costs, it's not possible for us to rent those, because at the moment kind of the retrofits seem to be so cost efficient, and because there's so much risk with the project. So kind of like the construction companies, they gave a really high price for the risk. Yeah. So then we can't afford those projects at the moment. But maybe there's a way of us finding new ways of funding. EU Foundation also this week just put out a green bond, which I think is also super interesting, or like all this like kind of green finance. Yeah, that's a big question, but also kind of like trying to find like alternative ways of financing things as the ARA, so that would maybe enables us to bear the risk by ourselves a little bit. So I think that's the way where we should look at, but at the moment it hasn't been financially possible.
Yeah, sounds familiar from the like office work, but yeah, this is interesting, the fact that like building companies they by pricing retrofitting projects higher because of the possible risks. It has a really big effect on what is decided actually to be built or taken down. So, and this is because we have so vast building stock of modern concrete houses, basically, or block of flats, that at some point, if this economic equation doesn't change, we are gonna lose quite a lot of like building stock that is already there.
Yeah, I was I've had one really inspiring talk with Satu Huuhka from Tampere. I don't know if you know her. Yeah, so then she's doing excellent work, and I don't know, maybe there's a chance of cooperation in the future. And then today I was discussing HOAS, this Helsinki student company. They've done a project like this in Rastila in Helsinki by an architecture firm called Concrete. So they have some experience. And today, actually, I was talking with a person from like Auratom real estate, and they've done quite a few of these projects, but they are super high-end, very example flats. But then what the guy was saying from there is that like all of the projects, they like the risks did realize themselves, like not all of the financial risk, but he said like in all of their 4 projects that they had done in Helsinki, kind of all of them, they needed to use some of that risk funding because there was always kind of problems.
And there are also benefits, aren't there? Not just ecological benefits to working with what we have. It means that people might stay in place or don't have to leave as long. It means that the neighbors don't have to put up with all the dust and the noise. We retain cultural heritage, for example. So I think there is there's a lot of other benefits as well, actually, to beyond just environment as well, social, cultural, even the modern heritage doesn't mean that these are things we don't value as well, and the aesthetic of that. And we can also upgrade buildings aesthetically by keeping more what we have. So I think that there's also huge benefits that way too. But I think if we have Sampa, do you want to draw anything else out now you're here?
No, thanks. I'm quite glad to hear that there is at least something going on this retrofitting team in Finland also.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Satu Huuhka is very much the person to talk to there as well. But I think then if we have no other questions from anybody else, I know that there was maybe 1 or 2 comments that came in that would have been very nice to have discussed with Faith, but unfortunately she's obviously had to leave. But we'll still pass these on to her. But I hope that this has been another inspirational kind of evening. I know a lot of ideas and thoughts. It's recorded, so we can always go back to it as well. But I just want to thank the speakers, of course, first Faith, then Inari, and also Jonathan for being here with us. I know it's a long day after a long working day. But I just want to say thank you, and everybody in the chat as well. So hopefully we can continue discussion over the next few weeks. But Raul, if you want to wrap up, let us know.
I was putting in the chat the link where they can see the next week we have another session to continue with this series. So I encourage all people to go to our website and to register themselves for the next week, in which we will continue discussing all the action we need to do, because as today we have seen that there is a need for us to act. There is also tension, because we know we can see that business is like the I will say the main barrier we have because it's not only about helping people, but also we need those main people who invest need profit. So it's quite complicated. But so for that, I encourage all of you to join us next week. We will keep with the discussion. Thank you for being here today. See you next week.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye. If you want to switch your cameras on, then we can just say see each other and say bye if you switch on the gallery mode. Bye.
Thank you for hosting.